What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different, as you probably saw by the title. I want to offer a bit of perspective when it comes to my thoughts on a talking point in the community. Well, recently, Andrew Chambers, Designing Play, released a video on fixing No Rest for the Wicked biggest problem, in which he went into detail about his perspective on healing in the game. As someone who is a fairly seasoned Souls-like creator and Path of Exile / Diablo creator and player, I want to offer a bit of insight on a point I think that Andrew is actually missing when it comes to the core design of the game. I want to be clear, this isn't a get good or an elitist type video. I know my skill level relative to some players may be a bit higher due to my time investment, so I am going to take that into consideration when I'm speaking about this, when I'm talking about my perspective. One thing to point out is No Rest for the Wicked is in early access and the development team seems to be taking feedback, so while I will say I completely disagree with almost everything said in his video, I do want to say I do respect your opinion and hope that the developers do actually see your input, as it is something a good portion of players actually say, so there is value in that even if I don't specifically agree. Anyways, Andrew's video is going to be linked down in the description if you want to take a look for context, and let me talk about my perspective now. So the first thing I wanted to point out was I did notice in your entire video that you showed footage purely in the first zone of the game, and the reason why I wanted to point this out is because, well, this very well could just be your editing style. I'm not sure if your perspective is from a player who experienced the game in a fairly good capacity or someone who only played in the early game, because historically in my almost 25 years of gaming, I can't recall a single time where early game was easy. I would argue that it objectively has been much harder than most parts of the game, except for like the super in-game stuff. Again, this could just be how you edit your videos, but I will say I don't think it's a healthy way to like give a perspective how healing works if you only experience the very beginning of the game. I would also like to point out that you did say that due to the system not really having a free heal system like Estaflas, that it limits your ability to learn, and I would say that's not necessarily true. Whenever you're playing a Souls-like game in the early game, your Estas are fairly limited. Yes, it's absolutely going to be free every time you die and come back, but more times than not, you're only going to have 3 or 4 if you're lucky. So to some degree, if you're prepared, you can have way more heals when you're fighting the first boss and many bosses in No Rest for the Wicked. So I would have to disagree on your point saying that it gives you the opportunity to experiment or less opportunity to experiment, because in reality, if you're prepared, you have significantly more time to experiment than you would in a Souls-like game where you only have 3 heals. But it does require you to put a little bit of effort to be prepared for it. And I think a lot of this has to do with the mindset of how players are perceiving the game rather than trying to experience the game for what it has to offer. You make a few other points where that mindset is pretty much the same, which I'll point out in a second. In the same vein though, I will say for a moment in the early game when I did fight the Torn guy, I had a brief thought that this could be pretty bad for players who like may run out of heals, who are probably worse than me, and they keep dying and then they quit. So to some degree that thought did cross my mind. I feel like you could easily fix that by just giving the vendor that already spawns there whenever you like unlock him, the Fervor guy, just let him give temporary heals that can be taken away right after you face the boss. You can just put a little pop-up that says, hey look, here's the heals, this is going to be temporary so you can prepare for battle with the Torn guy, and that's a really easy solution to just prepare players. I will say I don't believe that this actually needs to be in the game, because I felt it was fairly easy for a average Souls-like player, but it could be a solution. You could argue that this is a band-aid solution, but I would say that the early game is not nearly the majority of the game and not really something you should base most of your opinion upon. And now that we got that out of the way, I do want to talk about your healing solutions and why I agree with almost none of them. First off, I will say I am a very experienced player when it comes to games like Path of Exile and Diablo 4, but to my first point, the reason why I don't like a lot of these solutions that you offer is because I'm actually a pretty big fan of going around and gathering and finding the materials for healing. One thing that happens in games like Path of Exile is like you're almost always just slamming maps and always slamming in the game. There's almost never a time where you're actively just existing and having that tempo taken down a little bit and just enjoying the scenery in the world. This is actually pretty much the same for games like Dark Souls, where majority of the time there's just constant lurking danger. One thing that I'm an actual fan of that this game is doing is giving players the opportunity to kind of just chill and relax. I actually like the fact that I can go out and start farming resources to upgrade my base while also getting myself some extra resources to prepare for the next boss fight. It's a really nice change of pace, and I think a lot of your solutions kind of devalue this. Now for my second reason, I think it's just kind of lame. I think it's easy to just say, hey, let's just copy Dark Souls and implement an Esta, but I didn't necessarily sign up to play video games to always like do exactly the same thing. If that's the case, I can just go play Dark Souls. I'm a big fan that it offers a different type of gameplay. Is it hard? For me, no, but objectively it can be for some players. But that's kind of why I feel like players play video games in general. And if we just say, hey, let's just give them Estes, I feel like that kind of devalue experiencing a new game. Now, finally to my third and final reason, and this one I think you kind of heavily overlooked, and this is kind of why I asked at the very beginning if you actually experienced anything beyond the first zone. Because I feel like once you start to actually transition a little bit into the game beyond just the early game, you start to get affixes. I know you work for Blizzard, so you should be fairly familiar with these, but there are a lot of affixes in the game that are fairly versatile. You have a lot of them that gives you a good solution to a lot of the problems. For regeneration, there are affixes that give you just raw regeneration. Also, there are things like you can block, you get healing. Whenever you deal damage, you heal. Killing enemies will give you % healing. I can go on, but my point is, if you're only experiencing the early game or what the game has to offer, it's really hard to make a video saying that is a problem, when in reality, if you move on a little bit beyond just the very basic early game, you'll see a lot of the problems can be easily solved by just playing a little bit. Part of the reason I love games like Path of Exile and ARPGs in general is because I can actually solve for issues I have by, again, just playing rather than asking the devs to change a system that generally works fine. You actually have the tools you need, you just need to use them correctly. And if I'm being honest with you, at no time have I ever actually used my cash to purchase any of the healing items that you mentioned in this video. Yeah, again, there's definitely a fair argument that the early game could be balanced a little bit better, but personally, I don't see a lot of problems that you mentioned in the video, besides in the very early game where the game has a little bit of restriction on some of the resources. Obviously, I'm not a developer for the game and I don't know what they're gonna do with the future of it, but looking at some of the core system, when you actually like upgrade and explore all of them, the healing problem that you mentioned becomes mute and you actually start to see what you can actually do in the game. Anyways, that is pretty much my perspective on the whole healing issue. If I'm being completely honest, I don't really see a healing issue in any capacity. And while I'm never gonna ever tell a player to get good, because I don't really think that's a healthy message, I will say give the game a little bit more time and maybe invest a little bit beyond the early game, and you'll definitely see that a lot of these issues are really not issues. Once again, down in the description, I will have Andrew's video. Hopefully the dev team does get to see both of our perspectives, and maybe some players and viewers watching both our videos can leave some comments to give your perspective and your thoughts. Either way, thanks for watching.